Put your hands together for the one, the only Professor Tatum. Woo! All right, maybe I'm tooting my own horn a little bit. Brr, 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 brr. My bad. Let me humble myself a little bit. Say it is an absolute honor and privilege to be here to bring you yet another lecture for History 1302. And I'll tell you what, guys, today I'm going to offer you a new deal. All right. I won't take credit for what President FDR did, but we will be examining the New Deal in this lecture, which is our final installment in these series of lectures of the interwar era. So I know this looks like a whole lot at first glance, but we're generally going to look at what the New Deal was, how it worked, and how President Franklin Roosevelt began taking measures in his early days of his presidency to begin addressing the Great Depression. And then we're going to break down different types of programs that were included within his New Deal. And then we'll look at what's referred to as the Second New Deal. We'll look into how this New Deal was received. We'll see that it was widely accepted by some and very heavily rejected by others on both ends of the political spectrum. So we need to remember this very complex Great Depression caused by things like an unstable global economy, a lot of people in the U.S. buying stocks on the margin during the 1920s, followed by immense selling of stocks when the Federal Reserve made that statement that caused the public to panic, all led up to the stock market crash, which contributed to bank failures, which were further intensified when people started going on bank runs and pulling all their money out of the banks, causing banks to collapse. And this all resulted in this massive depression that went far beyond economics, right? People felt this depression as things like unemployment spread throughout the country, impacting people's lives in various ways. We saw how this impacted men, women, American youth, um, minorities, immigrants, people in agricultural areas, all feeling the pressures of this Great Depression. And remember that when people turned to President Herbert Hoover for help, he basically said, no, we'll let this thing kind of work itself out. I'll take care of big business. Big business will restabilize the economy. In the meantime, you guys can go seek support from your local communities, local charities, local governments. And as it turned out, business was not the solution. It did not manage to bring very much progress toward combating even unemployment, let alone the bigger economic issues at play. Furthermore, the local charities and even local governments really struggled to meet the high demand that there was for support during this Great Depression. And remember, by the time that he did start to take some action toward trying to ease some of the pressures of the Great Depression, it was just a little too late. So things like the Hoover Dam were only regionally beneficial, not really helping the rest of the nation. And again, remember, I suggested it's not that this guy is just trying to destroy the country or anything like that. He's simply just caught up in his own little whimsical world of wealth where he has no idea how bad common people are struggling. And by the time he realized and started taking actions, well, it was just a little too late. All of this, in addition to his response to the Bonus Army March, remember where he had the U.S. Army come in and beat up veterans and kick them out of the Capitol, lost him quite a bit of support. So he was not reelected into office. The next president elected who took his place was President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who you will hear me refer to through the rest of this lecture as FDR. So if we understand some things about FDR, I think we can understand a little bit about why he felt such a level of empathy and had such a desire to provide such a high level of support for the American people who were struggling during the Great Depression. So on one hand, we need to understand he was a very privileged individual from a very wealthy family. I mean, look at his last name. It's of no coincidence that we just saw a president a few lectures ago with the same last name. He's from that same family, so we know he's from a very wealthy family, right? But despite that very privileged upbringing, he faced some hardships that a lot of people around him couldn't quite understand, okay? Because he had polio and he was paralyzed from the waist down. And a lot of historians suggest that his paralysis is perhaps what helped him identify with the struggles of the American people and understanding that they had been misunderstood by many of their leaders. So FDR looked to the people around him, the other people in power, and said, you know what? As much as they may think they understand what I'm going through here, they have no freaking clue what it's like having to survive with this paralysis. And on that same level, perhaps he recognized that while people in power may think that they understood the struggle of the American people, there was no way they could fully understand what this Great Depression meant for them. All right. So he got very serious about trying to find ways to ease the pressures of the Great Depression. And I'm going to be very quick to suggest, and I'll reiterate this later in the lecture, that the New Deal is not going to end the Great Depression. A little more on that moving forward. But it will significantly ease the pressures, as well as do something else that I think is pretty cool that we'll look at toward the end of the lecture. So there's a lot of lore and myth around FDR's paralysis and why we very, very rarely see pictures of him in a wheelchair or using his crutches to stand up. And the kind of story that's been told over and over, so we've come to accept as fact, is that there was a gentleman's agreement between FDR's administration and the press that the press would only photograph him from the waist up. And that kind of helps feed into this idea that there was once a better and simpler time, and that all the struggles we have now are simply a result of nowadays, right? These days, the present. That's so freaking present centric, it's ridiculous. There was no gentleman's agreement, okay? Let's take a look here at what historians have more recently realized is a more accurate explanation for why there's so few photographs that reveal his paralysis.
He's being pushed in his wheelchair at Pearl Harbor back in 1944. You can see his hat.
This recently discovered film clip of President Franklin D. Roosevelt being pushed in a wheelchair has become an object of considerable public interest.
Rare footage of President Franklin Roosevelt showing the disability he kept secret from the American people.
An NBC Nightly News report on the discovery stated that there was a gentleman's agreement between FDR and the press corps to hide the extent of his disability. This notion of a gentleman's agreement has long been the conventional historical wisdom, but it's not accurate. As the Newspaper Industry Journal editor and publisher reported in 1936, if Secret Service agents saw a photographer taking a picture of Roosevelt, say, getting out of his car, they would seize the camera and tear out the film. A 1946 survey of the White House Photography Corps confirmed this, finding that anyone the Secret Service caught taking banned photographs had, quote, their cameras emptied, their films exposed to sunlight, or their plates smashed. The supposed gentleman's agreement was even less binding to some of the period's most powerful publishers, who opposed Roosevelt politically. In 1937, Henry Luce's Life magazine published a photo spread which included this shot of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. It's taken from a distance, but the caption clearly states that this is President Roosevelt. It is true that mentions of Roosevelt's wheelchair in the press were extremely rare. Mostly, news coverage depicted him as someone who had courageously triumphed over polio. This was the image that FDR and his advisors wished to project, and they largely succeeded. But the myth of the gentleman's agreement between the press and FDR persisted over time. Its likely source is our tendency to romanticize the past as a simpler time. But as historical research often shows, the past was every bit as troubled and complicated as our own time.
So again, this is a great example here of how the study of history is not something that is just fixed, and it should not be, okay? The way we interpret and understand and explain what happened will change over time, all right? And that's okay. Nobody's arguing over the fact of whether or not FDR did have paralysis. That's pretty freaking obvious. Nobody's trying to change history in that regard. What we're changing is the way we explain and understand the reason why that was hidden from the public, because there has been different evidence brought to light that change the way we should understand and explain that. Great example here of how the study of history works and continues to evolve over time. So very quickly after getting into office, FDR began addressing the Great Depression. One thing he did very quickly was he called for a bank holiday, which was a mandatory closure of all banks in the U.S. for 4 days. And during this span of time, while all the banks around the country were closed, bankers and financial experts all around the country were meeting together and discussing ways that they could move forward in a better direction once they reopened, and recognizing what practices they had engaged in that perhaps contributed to the failure of so many banks around the country, and how they could perhaps adapt those moving forward to help the banking system recover from this great hit that it took during the Great Depression. He also began a practice known as fireside chats. This referred to when he would have the press come, set up microphones here at his desk, and he would speak directly to the microphones, and they would come in people's radios as if he was there sitting with them by the fireside, just having a chat, having some drinks, having casual conversation. And this is one of the first times in American history that a sitting president directly spoke to the American people, and got down to their level. Okay. And in his first fireside chat, he reassured the American people of his support and offered them advice on how they could ease the pressures of the Great Depression. All right. He assured them, look, I understand you guys have been through a lot, and I want you to know that this is not anybody's fault. It's not any one person's fault. This is a global phenomenon. All right. This is much bigger than anything you've caused. I also understand you've sought support and it wasn't there for you. I need you to trust that I am here to guide you through this situation. But I need you to do what I ask you to do, and I need you to trust me to get you through this. And he said, look, I understand a lot of you have been taking your money out of banks, but that has really caused more trouble than it's helped. You'll also notice that banks around the country right now are closed. There's a reason for that. They're trying to figure out what they can do better on their end to function better for us. But we need you to do what you can on your end as well. Once these banks reopen, please, for the love of God, do not go pulling all your money out. And if you've already pulled all your money out of the bank, please go put some back into a bank, because that's how we're going to help the banking system get restored. And that's the first step to overcoming this harsh situation that we're in. And this worked. When he spoke directly to the American people like that, they took his advice. People returned to the banks after the big holidays and began returning their funds to the bank. And there was a gradual restoration of the banking system. Right? But FDR's big long-term plan for combating the Great Depression was, of course, what he called a New Deal that he was offering the nation. And this New Deal would be based on 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Now, it sounds like he borrowed quite a bit from his relative, another Roosevelt, who we've already seen when he was president, offered the nation a square deal based on 3 C's, right? Kind of following that legacy here. These 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform, were mostly implemented through what were referred to as alphabet soup programs. Okay, so you have things like the National Recovery Administration, NRA, Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. So all little acronyms that are very easy to identify with these programs. So what we're going to look at from here are examples of these different types of programs that were implemented as part of the New Deal. So we'll get some programs related to relief, then some related to recovery, and some related to reform. And as we begin to look at these programs moving forward, I'm going to strongly suggest that you don't overcomplicate their historical significance, all right? Because what we're looking at here is simply a bigger concept, well, in this case, programs for relief, and then we're looking at examples of that type of program, right? And we know that that is historically significant. So if you're asked on an exam, for example, to identify what the historical significance of the Federal Emergency Relief Act, or FARA, would be, you would simply say it was historically significant because it was an example of a program, a New Deal program for relief. Don't overcomplicate that. Keep it that simple. Moving forward, if you see programs that are examples of programs for recovery or for reform, boom, that's historically significant, right? Use that. That's what I want to see. But FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, provided immediate funding to the people who were struggling the most and really needed some money to just get themselves going and get back on their feet. Another example of a relief program would be the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. This created projects for young men to do work related to conservation. This included things like working on national parks and beaches. So, for example, if you've ever been out to Lake Corpus Christi, or Lake Mathis, as it's called, if somebody drowns there or something bad happens, right? There is this big stone building out there that people just refer to as the castle that overlooks the lake. Very beautiful building that you can get inside and kind of look over the lake. And that is a product of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Okay, it's something that young men went and built out to that park to kind of help add to the park. And the thing about this Civilian Conservation Corps is this is helping young men not only achieve immediate employment and get some money in their pockets, it's also teaching them valuable skills that they can continue to use long term to help them maintain employment as the job market starts to open up moving forward. I mean, this program appealed more to a lot of individuals than programs like FARA, because they're actually coming out and doing a lot of work to earn the funds that they're receiving. A similar type of program that's also an example of a program for immediate relief, is the Civilian Works Administration, or the CWA. Provided public works projects in local communities. A lot of this was things that would be considered busy work. So maybe, for example, one day you'll go and paint the courthouse beige, all right? And then you'll come back a few months later and they'll say, now we're painting the courthouse white. And then you come back a few months later and you paint it gray. And then a few months later, you paint it beige again and we leave it beige. Okay, but still, it's work. It's getting people out, giving them an opportunity to work and earn some income and get that money out in circulation. But this was not all busy work. Some of this was projects that were very beneficial toward local communities. All right, so those are some clear examples there of programs that are providing immediate, quick, short-term relief to the American people. Now we want to look at some programs that are geared toward longer-term recovery. A good example here would be the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. No, this is not the Roadside Assistance Company. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was geared toward helping people, as the name suggests, in agricultural areas, so namely farmers. We've seen, at least since the Gilded Age, with people like the populace, that farmers for quite some time have been struggling from a number of issues, one of which has been overproduction of crops, which has led to a decline in value of their crops, right? So here the federal government was paying farmers and giving them incentives to grow less crops, but also in some cases to destroy certain crops that there was excess of, and even in some cases to slaughter excess livestock. Because again, remember, there's less of a product, it has more value, scarcity equals value. So that would mean more income for farmers. And as you might imagine, this one was very controversial and did receive a lot of pushback. This was seen as an overstep of the federal government, encouraging people to destroy food supplies. And I'd hope that there are some people who are humane enough to realize this is also a complete waste of the life of the livestock that are being slaughtered just to help save some money. Another great measure taken toward longer term recovery is the 21st Amendment. Let's hear a big hoorah for that one. Hoorah! This amendment overturned the 18th Amendment, which of course established prohibition, prohibiting the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of alcohol. We now don't have to worry and be all clandestine about it if we want to enjoy a drink. But the goal here was twofold. On one hand, more tax revenue to the federal government. And in this particular case, that meant that could help fund more New Deal projects that could help continue to combat the Great Depression. And this also meant more income for farmers. All right. So if we think about what alcohol comes from, well, the basis of alcohol really is yeast and sugar and a little liquid. Boom, that's alcohol. But beer is made of barley, hops, different kinds of grains, right? Whiskey is made from corn, vodka, potatoes, gin, juniper berries, wine, usually grapes, and sometimes other types of fruits. All things that farmers grow, right? So it's definitely beneficial to them. Gives them an opportunity to earn some solid income. All right, another clear example of a recovery program is the NRA. And no, I'm not talking about the National Rifle Association. This was the National Recovery Administration. And this encouraged workers and employers and members of the government to work together to try to do things like set fair prices, okay? And FDR on his fireside chats would try to encourage people to buy from NRA-run businesses. The NRA would also have these stickers that businesses could put in their windows to kind of promote, we are working with the NRA, okay? We support the New Deal. We are part of this we are part of this effort to have business, labor, and government working together to provide the fairest prices and fairest standards for consumers as well as for workers. And that would encourage people to come and shop at this business because they know if they're shopping here, they're supporting the NRA, right? They're supporting, in a sense, the New Deal. This one also, as we'll see moving forward, is going to receive a good bit of pushback. Then there were also other New Deal programs that were aimed toward kind of the bigger picture, toward fixing the problems. So a clear example of that kind of reform program would be the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. So this federal organization oversaw and regulated activity on the stock market, They tried to avoid excessive stock speculation, people buying stocks as a get-rich-quick scheme, buying stocks on the margin, all things that we saw happening very excessively in the years leading up to the Great Depression, and definitely contributing to the stock market crash. Another example of a program for reform would be the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. This provided government insurance for bank funds. All right, so remember, I said if a bank shut down and you had money in that bank, you were SOL because that money was gone for good. Well, now the federal government will ensure that up to a certain dollar amount, which is a pretty high amount, they will make sure that your funds are protected. So if that bank shuts down, you will get that money back. All right, it's not gone forever. And this gave a lot of Americans incentives to trust the American banking system again. All right. People were very skeptical after banks started shutting down all over the country, right? That's why people started doing those bank runs. So this is kind of helping them realize, hey, it's okay. If we screw up, it's not on you. You're getting your money back. So all those programs we've looked at, geared toward the 3 Rs, are part of what's considered to be FDR's first New Deal. Most of those were implemented within his first 100 days in office. And pretty much everything after his first 100 days gets collectively referred to as the second New Deal. So I also want to look at some programs that were part of this second New Deal. So programs that, so New Deal programs that were implemented later in FDR's presidency. So one was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. So like other programs we have seen before, this encouraged public works, but this also provided jobs for people with physical limitations and for white collar workers. So a clear example would be historians received funding from this administration to do a lot of work. One thing that the WPA paid historians to do was to go and interview formerly enslaved people as they were all starting to die off. So a lot of what we know about slavery in American history comes from these interviews conducted by historians who were funded by the WPA. The WPA also, we can see, funded individuals like artists and musicians. A lot of great music that's very much reminiscent of that hobo culture that existed throughout the Great Depression. Songs from people like Woody Guthrie were again funded by the WPA. This also led to beautification of a lot of communities. All right, a lot of murals and public art was created in various communities, again, by funding provided from the WPA. This also, of course, bigger picture wise, was getting people out to work on these types of projects and giving them an opportunity to earn, easing the pressures they were facing from the Great Depression. Another program that was part of the second New Deal was the Social Security Administration. So the Social Security Administration established and oversaw what we now know as Social Security. So to understand what Social Security really is in very simple terms, is it's a collective pool of funds from payroll taxes that were kind of a safety net for retirees and for people with disabilities. Right? So basically, when you have a paycheck, there's a certain amount that's pulled from your paycheck that go toward funding Social Security, and that's for all workers around the country. We all pay into Social Security, and it creates this collective fund that gets paid out to us all when we retire. Or some people can cash it in early if they have disabilities that prevent them from being able to fully work. Fortunately, some people find ways to scam that in the system. And also, very unfortunately, while this is a great idea, it hasn't necessarily played out very cleanly. And there's also been a lot of pushback to this system. We'll see if we receive any of those funds that we've been paying into by the time we all retire. Let's take a look now at how the New Deal, and really FDR as the leader of the New Deal, was received. Even into the present day, his legacy is very mixed. But this is nothing new, all right? These are debates that were starting to pop up as his presidency was playing out and as he was implementing the programs of the New Deal. So we see evidence that he was widely popular. He was elected 4 times, demonstrating he was pretty widely supported if he could manage to get elected 4 times in a row. Now, some people are saying, what the hell? I thought you could only be president twice. Well, now you can because of this guy. All right, we saw this guy got away with winning 4 times in a row. And some people started to say, well, maybe that's a bit of an overreach of the federal government's power. We should probably put some limits on that. And that's why now there is a 2-term limit. And he did receive criticism from both ends of the political spectrum, meaning people on the political left and the political right. People in the Democratic as well as the Republican parties gave some pushback to FDR and to his New Deal. So some individuals on the far left claimed that the New Deal did not do enough to serve the country. Clear example here we can see is a politician from Louisiana, Huey Long. He served both as senator and as governor of Louisiana. He was openly a socialist. He advocated redistribution of wealth. He had a program called Every Man a King, where he suggested that all individuals should have a fair living wage. A guy like this who believes in more kind of radical ideas of really ensuring things like a living wage for all Americans, it's not surprising that he would suggest that the New Deal did not do enough to serve the poorest members of the community and that it could have gone a step farther. He really criticized the fact that the New Deal didn't do more to ensure equitable distribution of its benefits to the poorest Americans and especially to minorities. So we can see here Huey Long is a clear example of, sounds significant, critics who claimed that the New Deal did not do enough. But others claimed quite the opposite. Others claimed that FDR, as a politician, was pushing his luck too far, and that the New Deal was an overstep of government power. So, for example, there were several New Deal programs that were declared unconstitutional because they were seen as overreaching. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. People argued the federal government has no right to be telling farmers to be doing things like destroying crops. That is definitely an overreach of government power. And the Supreme Court agreed, and that was declared as unconstitutional. The National Recovery Administration. People said the federal government is taking way too firm of a stance here and trying to regulate business. Again, an overreach of government power. And the Supreme Court once again agreed and declared this as unconstitutional. Once a lot of these New Deal programs were kind of coming under attack and being declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, FDR cooked up a little scheme known as the court packing scheme. So his goal here was to have laws passed that would increase the size of the Supreme Court. Reason being is, as the president, he would be the one to appoint the justices, meaning the judges, to the Supreme Court. And if he had his supporters there in the court, he's basically packing the Supreme Court with his supporters. They're going to be a lot more likely to rule in his favor. So if they have to decide whether or not a New Deal program is constitutional, they're going to remember who appointed them to office, and they're more likely to say, yes, this is constitutional. Pretty interestingly, right around the time that the Supreme Court kind of stopped giving FDR such a hard time, and they started saying that a lot of his programs that were being brought to be judged by them were in fact constitutional, he just kind of backed off of this court packing scheme and let the whole thing go. Isn't that strange? He also received a lot of pushback, as I kind of suggested earlier, for serving in more than 2 terms. Now, again, there had been no constitutional amendment or any kind of law preventing this before FDR's presidency. And while there had been some presidents who had run for that 3rd term, no president had actually ever served a 3rd term. This broke a precedence that had been tradition since George Washington's presidency. When George Washington ran through his 2nd term, he kind of backed down, retired, and he said, it's time for some new blood. Let's get somebody else in there. I'm not a king. I am a president of a republic, and in this type of government, we place limits on our government, so it doesn't make any sense for me to stick around too long. I'm going to go ahead and back down. And other presidents moving forward kind of followed in that pattern. Again, there were some who ran for the 3rd term, but they were pretty unsuccessful. So when FDR ran for his 3rd term, he received a whole lot of pushback, even from within his own political party. Okay, a clear example we can see there would come from a guy named John Nance Garner. So John Nance Garner, actually from Texas, had been the vice president for FDR's first 2 terms. But when FDR announced that he was running for a 3rd term, John Nance Garner started to feel that FDR was overstepping his power. And he said, look, dude, not only is this New Deal getting a little out of hand and you're getting a little too powerful here, you're really pushing your luck by running for this 3rd term. And I'm not going to accept this. So we can see John Nance Garner was very clearly an example of critics who suggested that the New Deal and FDR were pushing their luck too far, right? That the New Deal, perhaps that FDR perhaps was overstepping his government power. All right, so I want to reiterate: the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. Some people will be very quick to tell you that. My dad, I remember when I was returning to school after taking some time off for personal reasons. I was going to take a class that was the interwar era, so 1920 to 1945, and he had to make a point to warn me. Now, those damn socialist professors, they're going to try to tell you all about how that commie FDR with his New Deal and all his big government spending is what ended the Great Depression. And that's just a lie that the liberals want you to believe. It was actually World War II that ended the Great Depression. Strangely enough, throughout my entire collegiate career, in all the classes that I sat in, as well as all the classes I observed later down the road as a supplemental instruction leader, I never heard a single professor suggest that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. We all kind of agree that that's ludicrous, that it was, in fact, World War II and the collective action during World War II that ended the Great Depression. But there is some credit that needs to be given here to FDR through his actions with the New Deal. On one hand, the New Deal absolutely eased the pressures of the Great Depression, made it a lot more manageable for Americans to get by throughout the remainder of the Great Depression. And by doing so, he helped restore faith in the American system. So I left off last lecture by suggesting that during this desperate period of the Great Depression, people in other countries around the world were beginning to turn to very radical ideas and starting to cling to promises made to them by very dangerous individuals, dictators who would do all kinds of very questionable things moving forward. And the US, as much as we don't want to admit it, is just another nation like everyone else and was just as vulnerable as any other country to falling into that same kind of trap during this very vulnerable moment in its history. And what FDR did here is, by restoring the faith of the American people in the American government, as well as in the American economy and the capitalist system, is he saved the country from falling into collapse. All right. Now, the American system of government and the American economy are far from perfect. There are plenty of critiques we can make about each of those. But hey, we live in a system where we have the right to make those critiques and to do something about it. And a lot of that is a result, I would argue, of the actions taken during this period here. Maybe I'm overstating it. As I've said before, I try not to indulge too much in a great man history, but this is a situation where I think there is absolutely a lot of credit due. I'm going to go ahead and end that there. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, this is it for Unit 2. You now have everything you need for Exam 2. Go and back it out. Over and out.